This story began one fine day when a young girl, who was a viscountess, came to a beautiful ball. Viscount Millis walked next to her, and the girl's name was Elena. She felt a little uncomfortable because there were a lot of people around, and the environment was new, and because of that, she just kept quiet most of the time. But the man, putting his hand on her shoulder, asked if Elena understood everything, because this banquet was a very important opportunity for her. He also explained that his fiancé Hans was also supposed to be present at this banquet, so she had to behave properly, especially in order to please him. Of course, the girl was very sad because her father always told her such things, so she just sighed heavily. She said that of course she did everything, and when they walked a little further, the Viscount suddenly pointed towards the guy with blonde hair and the rest of the people, saying that they belonged to the Leighton family. He pointed towards the guy, who was young and incredibly handsome. He had beautiful sky blue eyes, and he just shone against everyone else. Elena's father explained that he was the Duke of Leighton, and that the former Duchess was with him, and as soon as the girl saw them, she was sincerely surprised, because she understood perfectly well who this person was, and so she became worried. The former Duchess was a noble lady from a broken family who was sold simply into the service of the Duke. She became a widow after her husband, a former Duke, died immediately after she entered the family and got married. The stepmother was much younger than the Duke, who was at that time, and the subject of countless rumors was Willie Leighton, and she was a great bookworm. When the man and his daughter came closer, they immediately greeted the Viscount, bowed, and said that it was an honor for him to meet the Duke of Leighton, and that he was very glad that they were able to do so. Meanwhile, Elena just stood there and didn't even intend to say hello. She was still a little under the impression of everything that had happened. But as soon as her father looked at her with a stern gaze, she immediately came to her senses. The girl, having made a curtsy, immediately greeted them and said that it was also a great honor for her to meet them. However, at that moment, Elena felt very bad. She immediately covered her mouth with her hands and stood still. The girl was very worried. She did not know what to do. In fact, she starved herself for several days in order to stand out at the banquet with her beautiful figure. However, now her stomach began to actively protest and made itself known. She really felt simply disgusting, and it was very noticeable. Her father suddenly started shouting at her loudly and told her to straighten up and greet the Duke and Duchess properly immediately. He didn't understand what she was allowing herself to do. However, at that moment, Willie came closer to the girl. She took her hands and even covered her with her cape. The Grand Duchess looked her straight in the eyes and asked why she was so thin. The girl noticed her very thin arms and noticed that, from her, there was only skin to Kostya. She did not look healthy at all. As soon as the Duke of Militant heard all this, they were shocked. For some time, everyone around was silent. They did not know how to react to this. But Willie continued to scream. She said that she was amazed that the girl could wear such an open dress in such cold weather. Of course, she probably felt cold, and because of this, she did not feel very well. She wondered if she was really that thin and continued to wear a corset and high heels. The girl really didn't understand how that was even possible. She asked Elena if the girl had eaten anything at all, but without waiting for an answer, she said that she absolutely had to eat immediately. Willie looked closely at her face and also said that there was not even a hint of any other color there except pale, so she was very worried about her sincerely. But when Elena looked at this girl, she immediately remembered her dear grandmother, to whom she came and who always took care of her. And the grandmother always insisted that the girl was too thin and that she needed to be fattened up because it was very unhealthy. In fact, Willie, before she got married, was a noble lady from a family that simply sank into a lot of debt, and the only thing she could do was find a job as soon as possible in order to somehow improve her family's situation. Therefore, even from an early age, she desperately began to earn money in order to somehow survive. When the villa began to work day and night, she did not understand why the exhaustion that she felt was so familiar to her. And at that moment, memories of her past life came to the girl. She suddenly remembered all the events of her past existence. In fact, in her past life, she was Kim Hana, a modern academy teacher who died at a very early age. And after she died, she was transported to a fantasy world. Of course, the girl assumed that it could have been some kind of obsession or just reincarnation, but she didn't know for sure. Willie decided that since she had at least some memories, she could use them in her new life and perhaps not make any similar mistakes. And at the moment when she was thinking about all this, her family suddenly went bankrupt and lost absolutely everything. Of course, the girl did not expect such a turn of events. However, as expected, she was treated as damaged property. Therefore, she was simply sold, even though she was their own daughter. In this girl, they will come out and share only the benefits for themselves, so they gave her away and received at least a small amount so that they could live independently. Willie was incredibly shocked because the concept of human rights in this fantasy world was rather vague. There wasn't even any special system for refusing an inheritance, and perhaps even a title, so the girls just had to endure it all. And then, one day, a rather grown man in uniform came to them. He saw the girl and said that she was rather quiet. So he decided to take her for himself. So, as expected, Willie was bought as a bride for an old nobleman who had already buried his 4 wives. So, without having the right to vote, she simply went there to meet her most terrible fate. While she was riding in the carriage, she received a paper which stated that her last name was now Leighton. They talked about how this was the greatest noble family in the West. However, she was still surprised by the fact that they simply arrived at a slave warehouse and bought themselves a wife. She also understood perfectly well that the fact that he had 4 previous wives who had died meant that she had to work very hard there so that she would not be sent to the next world as well. The girl became very sad and did not understand whether she could simply run away from there, whether she could afford to do this. However, she did not have time to think about it properly, and soon, when Willie arrived, she was immediately informed that the owner had left. The man who met her replied that it only happened last night, that he had a heart attack. And despite the fact that the wedding did not take place, she was still considered his wife, and therefore had to be present at the funeral. As soon as Willie heard this, she couldn't believe that it was really true. Not only did she get married for the first time in her life, but she also became a widow incredibly quickly. The ducal house, which was plunged into chaos, did not have time to greet their new lady. Everyone was still shocked, so they mostly just ignored her. The girl was sent to a separate place of residence, without even being introduced to the territory or the family, and after 2 whole months had passed, she finally came to the understanding that this was not normal. One day at breakfast, a maid came to her and said that it would be nice if Madame dined in the main house with the Duke. Ville replied that she was fine and that she was quite happy with the place where she lived. She did not want to bother anyone or disrupt their everyday life. Anna also smiled happily and said that she enjoyed living in this place with her and her other assistants. As soon as the maid heard this, she was truly touched to the depths of her soul. She was very pleased to hear these words, and Willie also asked if she had any planned visits to the main house that day, since Anna had to go there from time to time. The maid replied that this was not so. Last week there had been a ceremony of the appearance on the Holy See, so His Grace was still very busy with his affairs. She also said that there was to be a banquet in honor of the end of the year. They said that a high-ranking guest from the imperial family was also to arrive. It was quite a large event, at which a lot of people would gather. But as soon as Willie heard about these noble guests, she immediately became a little worried. She understood that it had nothing to do with her. However, all the same, Anna said that with the sudden death of the former Hertz A, she must have had an endless amount of different work, so she was very worried about her mistress. But Willie replied that she was fine, so she didn't need to think about it or worry about it. Of course, it might seem that the girl cared about services. However, she was really happy with this life. She was happy with what she had, and the girl did not want to change it. And compared to the days when she lived in poverty with her family, or even in slavery, this life was a real luxury for her, and she was content with what she had. She was so happy with everything that she was ready to simply spend the rest of her life in this outbuilding next to her maid, and not go anywhere or socialize in any way. However, she still believed that once all the matters were sorted out, she would be kicked out anyway. No one would want to keep a young widow with whom they had never even spoken. And Willie? She understood this perfectly well. She knew that after she had to leave this place, she would certainly need to return to the capital and perhaps start her own business. Or maybe the girl thought that she could travel a little. She really hoped that she would be given at least a little money for startup capital so that she would then, based on this amount, know what to do next. At the moment when the maid left after some time, someone knocked on her room again. She thought that Anna had forgotten something, so she allowed them to enter. However, then the door opened and the butler, who was also her closest assistant, entered, bowed, and asked for forgiveness for disturbing her. He explained that the lady wanted to see her, and that was why she had sent him to convey this message to the girl. The girl immediately became wary. She did not understand why Duchess Leighton could suddenly call her. She was really worried and couldn't even imagine what business she might have with the girl. The butler immediately said that this concerned her future agreements, so the meeting was a must. And Willie, hearing this, immediately became angry, because she understood that the time had really come for this. With a heavy sigh, she said that she had agreed to this meeting, and then asked if she had to go there right then, and the man said yes. She did not hesitate, and immediately followed the butler, who was leading her to this very meeting. The girl was still a little worried because she did not know what to expect. They walked in silence for some time, and the butler broke the silence by saying that the lady had also asked her to watch her manner of speaking. As soon as the girl heard this, she was very surprised. She did not understand why it was necessary to make such a request at all. She assumed that Madame most likely wanted her to give up her place and speak formally, and because of this, she was very wary. The assistant also said that the circumstances could be complicated. However, the girl was still senior in rank, and Madame strictly observed the entire hierarchy. So this was a mandatory condition. The man explained that she expected Willie to address her as his bride. The girl, upon hearing this, immediately said that she understood everything, so of course she would observe the subordination that should have been. She was well aware that she was much younger than her own husband and was a stranger to her. However, she still insisted that Willie treat her as a superior. Of course, it impressed her very much. Soon they came to the right room. The door was slightly open, and the girl could see a small, neat silhouette of a woman there. She was an impeccable noblewoman, who was worthy and pure treasures of the West. It was Helen Leighton. After a while, the girl came inside and immediately greeted her, and Helen quickly turned to look directly at her. Willie couldn't believe that pride was less important to her than order. This girl was much older than she was, and therefore she didn't understand at all how she could treat her. But Helen, without even smiling, greeted her, lived a good day, and even called her her mother. It was quite strange and unusual for Willie to hear this, but she did not show it on her face so as not to violate their etiquette. The girl felt very uncomfortable around her and thought that it was all very strange. Smiling, Willie turned to her and said that she wanted to apologize for the fact that so much time had passed since they were finally able to meet. Helen responded to, it was completely calm, however. She replied that it was very good that they finally met, after which she pointed to the sofa that was nearby and said that she could already sit down. After that, the girl waved her hand towards the maid and asked her to go and bring them some fresh tea, because they had a rather serious conversation ahead of them. Willie, sitting down on her seat, thought about the fact that she had to behave like a mother-in-law who came out of nowhere. Her life was really very strange, but she had to follow these rules. However, what was most important to me was Helen. She was a member of the imperial family, and this woman was truly elegance itself. As soon as the maid finally brought them tea, the woman said that she should first just put it on the table, and after that, they would decide for themselves what to do. Willie thought about it at that moment and realized that when they talked about the ideal noblewoman, of course, Helen was always mentioned first on that list, because she was one. She was a woman known as the pinnacle of high society, a model of prestige for a noble family. Helen was the most famous among all the nobles and revered. After the girl drank some tea, she immediately turned to Willie and asked how she had managed to chew all that time. The girl immediately said that everything was fine with her, and also asked Helen how she felt. Madame was a little surprised. However, she said that, as always, she was quite a busy lady, because there were many different things that needed to be done. Willie at that moment thought about what she was hinting to her about being too busy to call her. She thought that she should ignore it and not take all these words personally. They drank tea for a while in complete silence, and Helen said that first she would like to discuss the upcoming events that were to take place very soon. Willie, of course, was not happy about this. However, she kept a calm expression on her face and said that, looking ahead, she would like to give her answer already. Well, Helen said the first thing she said was that they would like to accept her as an official member of the lieutenant family. And hearing this, the girl was sincerely surprised she could not contain her emotions, so she screamed loudly and asked, "Was it really true?" However, the girl quickly controlled her emotions and was truly shocked that she could say such a phrase without thinking. She didn't understand what was happening at all, because she was absolutely sure that she would be kicked out. However, Helen replied that when she was to become a true member of the Leighton household, they would like her to attend the Old Year's celebration and the various New Year's banquets with them. Willie knew that even she, who had never been part of high society, knew how important the banquet at the end of each year was in the duchy. Therefore, the girl realized how large-scale and serious this event was. No matter how influential the lieutenant house was, it would be very difficult for her to avoid rumors if she really did as she wanted. The girl was silent for a while. She doubted Willie knew that she also mentioned that at the banquet. Yes, he was a very high-ranking guest present. And even if the duchy used the term, it meant that someone was of extremely high status, since that was usually the case. In fact, she wanted to ask if they had all accidentally gone crazy, whether they liked it or not. However, she was not part of this family. She was a real stain there. Willie had to think carefully about what she should do. She even assumed that they were simply helping her out of pity. However, she believed that this was not charity at all, and in her opinion, it would be wrong to act like that. The title of mother-in-law alone already had considerable power. They would not have brought her position into the house for sentimental reasons, but she did not understand. What was the point of doing all this then? At that moment, the girl thought about the fact that this decision could belong not only to Helen, because the butler behaved rather strangely when he led her to the room. It didn't matter how much Helen put the rule above her personal pride. She didn't know whether Willie really should be higher than her in this whole hierarchy. The House of Leighton was one of only 2 Hertzian houses in the entire empire, and it was quite important. And the only person who could put pressure on them. It was of course His Majesty the Emperor, so Willie immediately asked if he had influenced their decision. As soon as Helen heard about His Highness, she even froze in place. She drank tea and choked a little because she expected to hear something like that. However, Willie did not demand an answer now. She immediately understood everything from the girl's reaction, so she was not at all surprised. At that moment, the girl realized that the Emperor had made his position quite clear. If you think about it, the new emperor had ascended the throne last year, and Willie had heard that he supported the Eastern faction, so she assumed that they played a decisive role in his rise to power. At the same time, Leighton led the Western nobility, and the first empress of the covered emperor gave birth to the first prince and Helen before finally passing away. The emperor who was in power at that time was the child of the second empress. He ascended by defeating the first prince, who was previously the crown prince and first in line to the throne. For the emperor, the Leighton house and Helen was his half-brother's half-sister, and they were political enemies. However, the House of Leighton owned enormous wealth and lands, which meant that it had considerable influence in high society as well. The newly crowned emperor did not dare to provoke them without caution and harm their reputation, or to start a political maneuver against them would have been very difficult. If the previous duke had not died suddenly, this could not have happened. However, the death of the former duke created an open door for them. Willie realized from Helen's reaction that the emperor was also involved, and that meant that the picture was now becoming clearer to her. A former cruel duke who married 4 wives and buried them all suddenly dies. However, the House of Leighton, who bought the 5th wife, wanted to give her up as she was no longer needed. Willie understood that this was a very serious moral error for the emperor, who kept the noble register. This was the perfect excuse to intervene in the whole situation. And if we are realistic, it becomes clear that no one except the emperor himself could have forced the House of Leighton to accept the fallen noblewoman as their stepmother. So in the end, their family decided to accept the parasite Willie, rather than earn the emperor's blessing if they simply expelled her. These people simply had no choice, and that is precisely why they made this decision. By keeping the parasite and Willie close, they eliminated any excuse for interference. And even if the emperor hadn't put such pressure on them, the duchy would still act like this out of fear. In any case, it showed how sensitive the House of Leighton was to political changes in the empire. So now, instead of kicking her out to Willie, they had to help and do everything so that the girl wouldn't run away from there on her own. The ladies were silent for a while, and Willie smiled and said that all this was very interesting for her. As soon as Helen heard this, she immediately looked at the girl with alarm. She understood perfectly well that with this lady and Maroki, there would be even more than she could have imagined. Willie understood perfectly well at that moment that this was what they called the so-called political struggle. Helen didn't respond to this. She just sat and looked at the girl with a very stern look, trying to understand what she was planning. Willie said that her life in the annex was quite comfortable, and she did not think that she would have any problems in the future. And since Helen asked her, she would of course be happy to be present at this wonderful banquet, which was to take place very soon. However, looking at her with her surprised gaze, she said that she was lacking a lot for this event, so she really hoped for her help and cooperation. She was with me for more than a week, and we really didn't have any accessories or even a dress for this event. Although she knew absolutely nothing about questionnaires, she at least understood that she could not come to such an important event in her usual clothes or in her pajamas. So she smiled and asked Helen to help her buy a few things for this ball, as it was important for all of them. The girl reacted to this quite calmly. She bowed her head down and said that she understood everything perfectly well, and also asked if she needed anything else. Willie thought for a while, and then said that she had heard that winters in the West were cold, so it would be good to have some extra outerwear as well. Helen said that since that was all, she would definitely send a tailor here immediately so that they could resolve this issue as quickly as possible. At that moment, a maid approached her, and the girl immediately told her the whole situation and said that the tailor was needed not for her, but for the children who worked in their extension. When Helen asked how many outfits she needed, Willie replied that she thought it might be about 30. Helen was genuinely surprised to hear this. She didn't understand how this could even happen, because she basically had to attend one event. However, she didn't object. Meanwhile, the girl, seeing their surprised expressions, said that she just thought that the clothes with the bow seemed a little thin, so she wanted to update them. However, Willie knew perfectly well whose idea it might have been to make the poor maids wear such tight tops. Anna would come to her bedroom every morning and mutter about how incredibly hot she was. In the outfit she had to wear all the time. After a short silence, Willie said that she thought that might be enough, so that was what she ordered. Helen was amazed and immediately asked the girl if she was really sure about what she wanted to do. The girl firmly and confidently said that, of course, this was her final decision, and she was not going to change her mind. She saw that her maid, and Helen herself, looked rather confused, but she couldn't do anything about it, because she really wanted it to happen. Now that Willie understood how everything worked in this place, the girl suggested that perhaps Helen thought that she could ask for more money or some jewelry. However, in reality, this was not the case. The girl did not need all this. She was well aware of the fact that greed always led people only to greater troubles, so she did not ask for some things that she had. Well, she did not even need. And even if the situation in that place had completely changed, Willie would still remain an ignorant stranger who had no real position in the duchy. She would always remain on the sidelines, and the girl was aware of the fact that if she acted too recklessly, she could simply be made into a dummy and removed quite quickly. So she decided to take only what the duchy offered her, and nothing more. She decided that this was the phrase she had to stick to, since everything changed, because she simply had no other choice. After some time, Willie stood up from her seat and said that since all the issues had been resolved, she would like to go back to her place, since she also had one meeting in the morning. She understood that it was time for her stepdaughter's children to arrive as well. The girl knew very well that magic existed in that world. However, she did not know if they could make something like a washing machine with warm water. But before she left, she also turned to Helen again and said that she thought the girl was just a wonderful bride and was very pleased with the guy's choice. As soon as Helena heard this, she was at first a little surprised and even a little confused, but then, quite quickly, she returned to her usual composure. And she immediately asked Willie what she meant when she said such things. The girl, turning around and approaching the exit, replied that these were not just empty words, but a real compliment, because that's what she thought. Willie knew perfectly well that calling someone mother, especially someone you despised, was not an easy thing to do. However, Helen managed it. The power of a mistress who wore a mask for her family, so Veli felt that she understood. It's completely different now, so she decided to change the relationship a little. When Willie finally left, Helen went to the window and began to follow her with her gaze. She had been thinking about this girl for quite a long time. She understood perfectly well that she was quite caring about her servants and remembered all their names in just 2 days and also tried in every way to improve their lives. Even though they were her servants, sometimes, of course, she could be quite harsh in her words. But in fact, Anna told Helen that the girl was really very worried about her. At that moment, the woman seriously thought about whether this was really just a kind-hearted woman or whether she was planning something. Helen quickly pushed these thoughts away from herself. She closed the curtains and raised the curtains, which definitely could not have happened. The girl understood that even if she did not try to hide it. However, only because of this short conversation, she understood the situation and the political climate. Of course, the status of the Vide could be very low. However, her ability to assess the situation was an indisputable fact. She immediately thought about the fact that he knew this fact, that the girl's specialty at the academy was political science, which is why the girl was so well known in all this. As Helen closed the curtain, she thought that someone who knew so much about politics couldn't be all good, which meant that it could all just be a show for the public. The girl also wondered whether she should send a butler there to keep an eye on all this. The man was the closest aide who was brought from the imperial palace, and he remained independent of the changing currents of the empire. However, he was also very kind and fair, not the type that could be useful to Helen at such moments, so she changed her mind about this decision. The girl sighed heavily and thought that she was supposed to meet the children in a few minutes. She had spent too much time thinking about the villa. Although it was all completely useless, the meeting was booked for an hour, but she needed to cut that time short because she had wasted too much of it talking to her stepmother, so she just couldn't afford it. However, Helen also thought about why the children were still outside. She even thought that she should definitely remind the nanny to be more punctual, and because this could have a very bad effect on their upbringing. After that, the girl finally closed the curtains and went about her business, since she no longer had time to do anything. Of course, Helen was very surprised by the fact that Willie thought she was a wonderful daughter-in-law, and even thought that she did not understand when the girl could make such a judgment, because she did not even really see her. It was their first meeting. These eyes that looked at her with a rather surprised look almost all the time, and the girl understood perfectly well that Willie was much younger than her, and she didn't understand how the girl could make any judgments at all, as if she could see right through her heart and already draw any conclusions. She considered this completely unacceptable and even stupid. And after that, she went to meet her children. In fact, in her past life, Willie really loved working at school, even though the salary was small and it took a lot of effort. One day she was talking to a student who said that one of the books described absolutely everything: regression, obsession, and even reincarnation. The girl repeated this several times and said that it was very important, so it was necessary to remember this girl. Then smiling said that it was really so, but she herself did not understand such an old, even to some extent, obsession with this story. But the student explained to her that these 3 points were some of the most fundamental foundations of virtual novels. This was in all the stories. She also said that all 3 reincarnation possession regressions shared the same concept of preserving past memories and knowledge. Regression was a return to a specific point. In the past, possession meant entering someone else's body. Usually, the person who took over that body knew the original owner and all of his past. And at the very end, this reincarnation was something similar to regression. It implied a rebirth into a completely new person. Although at the same time, the mind and memory from the previous life were preserved. In fact, Willie was very happy that the student told her about all this and spoke quite long and extensively, because this knowledge helped her as soon as she transformed into her character. However, of course, this did not mean that this basic knowledge was enough. The girl would like to become a teacher of world history, even in that world, because she liked it. And even in a fantasy story world, she would have a better understanding of human rights, working conditions, and culture than everyone else, because she already knew the basics. Child labor was the norm at that time. And also the 14-hour workday, the endless exploitation of people. All this was simply the most terrible for the girl. She sighed heavily and thought that since this was an extension, she had changed the schedule at her own discretion and could do so quite often. Elena immediately told Anna that every morning she didn't need help washing her face. It was enough that the girl simply prepared her breakfast and food in general. And as soon as the girl heard from the maid that she always tried to clean while the girl was sleeping, and at dawn in order not to disturb her, she was even more irritated. She told Anya that she could do it absolutely, whenever it was convenient for her, and she didn't have to wait for a moment when the girl wouldn't see it. The oldest of these unfortunate children, who had been working for a very long time, was no more than 10 years old. She couldn't believe that these children were able to work to earn money for their family, which meant that things were so bad that even they had to work hard. She knew that if they were of noble family or worked under a knight, it would at least be a little more genteel. However, these kids were stuck in the manor, doing absolutely all the dirty work, and weren't even properly rewarded. And even when she heard that Leighton treated his servants relatively well, she could still imagine how bad things were in other places. However, she understood that she couldn't just tell them not to work in that era. Taking away their jobs meant taking away their place in society, so Elena had to come up with some other way to relieve them of this suffering. It wasn't just the bosses giving orders. It was a problem with society that forced young children to work from a very early age. A little girl who was at lunch at the time suddenly approached Elena, looked at her, and said that Madame had given her such a penetrating look again. The woman looked at her in surprise and immediately asked what she meant, and the little girl said that Madame's expression was rather harsh. Elena immediately became worried. She did not understand how this could happen at all, and assumed that it meant that she looked even scary, and this caused the girl's discomfort. But smiling softly, she said that everything was fine. There was nothing that she should worry about, and also asked if she had finished her potatoes yet. The girl immediately jumped up happily and said that this was exactly it, and Elena also asked if she would like another portion. Well, the child replied that she was absolutely fine, after which she looked down and became a little embarrassed, because in fact she would not have been against it. She wanted another portion of food, but she could not allow herself to do so. Elena understood perfectly well that this was what she wanted, and also thought about the fact that perhaps she could allow the girl to sit on her lap so that she would feel some closeness and care. Smiling happily, she pointed to her feet and asked if she would like to sit next to her. The girl's eyes immediately lit up. She asked, could she really do this? And Elena, stroking her head, immediately said that, of course, because she herself suggested it. When the girl did so, she immediately began to talk to the lady and asked if she was going to stay there. The woman immediately replied that of course she had really hoped for this and really thought that she could do it. Then the girl, looking down again, said that it was a great relief for her to hear this. She was really very glad that Elena could stay with them. The girl herself at that moment thought that the children thought that she was going to leave the extension, and especially considering all the rumors going around, this was completely unsurprising. She didn't know if she should count it as thanks to the emperor. However, she was still very happy and grateful that she could stay in the annex and help these children at least a little. After a short silence, Elena asked what they were supposed to be working on that day. The girl, hearing this, immediately smiled and said that they had to go into the garden and pull out all the weeds that were growing from the pines. They were cruel, so they had to put in a lot of effort to do everything perfectly. As soon as Elena heard this, she immediately became sad because she understood that no one was going to help these children. They had to do everything themselves, and so she replied that it sounded quite difficult. But the girl also said that they were lucky. After all, they had someone who was good at pulling. It was Johan, and he was really good at that. As soon as the girl heard this, she was immediately surprised and asked who he really was. In fact, she had never heard of this boy before. She thought she had memorized all the names of the children and servants who worked in the estate. However, it turned out that there was another person she had never even heard of. The little girl, a little embarrassed, said that Johan was a boy messenger and he worked only for a day's wages. She explained that he was hired by a gardener. However, although there was a lot of work in the spring and summer, in the fall there was practically none, so he worked and tried to help them as much as possible. However, when they asked him to help them, he refused because he did not want to. Elena was surprised to hear this and immediately asked why this happened. The girl was silent for a while, trying to figure out how to answer best. And then she simply said that he was afraid of the nobles. He thought that if he made a mistake, they would take a whip and beat him half to death. She explained that they were trying to tell him that the girl was not like that at all. However, Johan had seen his previous master and therefore did not trust anyone else. She also said that the boys didn't have much work to do for wages in the winter, unless it was a day like that they were pulling frozen weeds and they weren't even paid for it. She also said that Johan had no parents, so the girl was incredibly worried about him. So she tried to spend time with him as often as possible so that he would not feel lonely. It was actually very painful for Elena to even think about it. But when she remembered the previous hurts, she was ready to understand that it was quite understandable why Johan was afraid now. Then she asked the girl if Johan had really found her all alone, and the little girl replied that he had lived with his younger sister. She was too small, so he had to earn everything himself until she grew up and could go to work. However, recently, they had absolutely nothing to eat, so he said that they survived on a porridge made from the bark of a tree, which was the only thing that could give them any nutrition. Elena then turned to the other children, who were also on break, and asked if they were close to him. One of the guys said that it was true. He was strong and smart, so he helped them in many ways, even when it was not his job for which he was paid. And at that moment, Elena suddenly thought that this boy, whose name was Johan, seemed to her quite friendly, because everyone loved him, and he always tried to help these children. After a short silence, she asked if they were really sure that Johan was good at his job. The children immediately said in one voice that it was true that he helped them wonderfully. And Elena, at that moment, seriously thought about the fact that perhaps she needed to somehow meet him and as soon as possible. She knew that she needed a boy to send external tasks anyway, and hiring someone from outside was quite dangerous. And this way, she would be able to do two things at once. Some time had passed since then, and Johan was already in position, very quickly and deftly pulling out the weeds that he had promised to help the children with. The sun was shining quite brightly, and even a little hot, so the guy, because he was trying to do everything quite quickly, even started sweating a little. However, when he looked towards the estate, very unpleasant memories of that place immediately came flooding back to him. It really was his greatest trauma in his life. He learned for himself even at such an early age that he could never trust the nobles because they always let him down even when they tried to be kind and nice. Once in the past, his master beat him very badly with a whip. Even though the boy apologized to them and asked for mercy, he didn't care. The owner yelled at him and asked how he dared to put grass on his boots, because that was how he got them dirty. He also, hitting harder and harder each time, said that this is why people like the boy were disgusting to him. He did not understand at all how it was possible to be so terrible, and they made him sick. Johan did not understand how the nobles could treat people like animals just because they could not pull out a single weed on their own. They had to hire additional forces, which they treated simply terribly. Of course, he understood that if he became a servant, then everything would be a little better than at that moment, as it was for him. But if he died because of this, then his dear sister Lily would be left completely alone. He didn't care about money at all. After all, it was in no way more important than life. So after a little rest, he returned to doing his job. Each time the boy pulled out the weeds more and more intensely and realized that since he was still standing, he had to be grateful, so he was going to do everything he could to justify the money he was receiving. But at that moment, he suddenly raised his head up and saw not far from him a rather beautiful young girl who was sitting on the ground and looking at something there. Johan was incredibly surprised when he saw her. He immediately froze in place and could not take his eyes off this girl. He did not understand who she was, and also why she was there. He knew it wasn't even the middle of winter yet. However, she was wrapped in a huge and very warm coat, so this immediately surprised him and even made him wary to some extent. Johan was about to get back to work immediately. However, he knew he needed to pull out the weeds that were under her feet. However, he could not understand why. Of all the places to sit and look at something, she chose the place where he had to work. This really angered him. Gathering his courage, he began to approach her closer and thought that, judging by her simple clothes, and because she had no servants, he could conclude that she was not a noblewoman. It was for this reason that the guy began to feel more confident, because he knew that it was much easier for him to communicate with ordinary people. And when the guy came up, he immediately asked for forgiveness. He said that he was planning to pull up weeds in the place where she was sitting and therefore would ask her to step aside. As soon as Elena heard this, she immediately turned to him and said that she really did end up in his way somehow, so she asked for forgiveness for this. The girl immediately stood up, and the guy bowed at that moment, thanking her for being understanding about this. Of course, he understood that she looked nothing like a noblewoman, but he was very alarmed by the impression she made on him. Her mere presence made him behave even differently. However, at that moment, as soon as the girl stepped aside, she immediately asked the guy if it was true that he was Johan. The boy, hearing this, was sincerely surprised. He immediately looked at her and did not understand how she could know about him at all. Elena, meanwhile, tenderly smiled, said that she heard about him from Marania, and, as soon as the guy heard, this then immediately became clear to him. Everything he stopped being nervous, because this girl was still very talkative. But Elena went on talking and said that she had heard that he was quite a handsome weed puller and wondered if it was true. The boy was still a little embarrassed by these statements. However, she said that he thought he was pretty good at weed control. Therefore, he was good at his job. Then I said to Lena that it seemed to her during this small conversation that he was also, in addition to everything else, very smart, very affectionate. Maronia spoke about him and said that he was a very kind older brother and always took care of his sister. However, Johan, upon hearing this, did not immediately understand whether it was a compliment at all or even some kind of remark. The girl at that moment sat down again at the same level with him, and Johan immediately noticed that she smelled very nice. It was not the strong scent that nobles usually used, just to show off their wealth and what kind of perfumes they could buy. It was a really delicate scent. It was a sweet smell of oil and herbs that he liked incredibly much, and he even had a feeling as if he had already smelled this aroma somewhere before, but he couldn't remember where. After a long silence, Elena looked at the boy and suddenly asked a very unexpected question. She asked if he liked potatoes by any chance. Johan was genuinely surprised to hear this. However, the girl handed him some potatoes that smelled nice and were still hot. She said that it was certainly not that spring potato. However, it was still quite tasty and suggested that he try it himself. The boy looked at the food with a very surprised look. He could not believe that this unknown girl had actually offered him this wonderful potato. In fact, this dish emitted the same pleasant aroma that he felt when his grandmother and mother were still alive. They always prepared similar dishes, and the aromas were very similar. And it especially reminded him of the aroma of cooked herbs, which they very often added to food, the smell of baked bread. It was all very familiar and so dear. At that moment, Elna also took out a small jar and said that if he had difficulty cleaning it, she could help him with this and simply asked him to let her know if anything happened. She also handed him the jar and said that she had cinnamon tea and asked if the boy would like to try it, because it was really delicious. Some time had passed since then. They had already had a snack together, and Elena was returning back to the castle thinking about everything that had happened. The conversation that took place between them was really, despite the fact that it was very awkward, but quite pleasant. Johan was very cautious, so she couldn't get even a little closer to him and maybe ask him about his sister, because he always kept his distance. She was very upset that she couldn't interest him as usual, and therefore even thought that her reputation as an instructor at the academy was already starting to fade. However, before leaving, the boy asked the girl if he could visit her again. Elena then smiled happily and said that, of course, she was in that place every Wednesday morning, and also offered to bring fried potatoes again, so that they wouldn't get bored. Johan just nodded his head and smiled a little, but in fact he was happy that he could find at least such company, and that she was not an aristocrat, and since she was very kind. As soon as Elena remembered this, she immediately smiled and thought that he was really quite a smart boy, and she liked it. Of course, she didn't know much about the situation outside the castle that was happening on the territory of Leighton, and she thought that if she could get Johan to do a little investigating, it would be quite useful for her, because she would be able to find out a lot of things and use it to her advantage later. Since she was Lady Leighton, she should at least be familiar with the affairs of the territory. It was also a good opportunity to offer Johan a decent job for good pay, and so that it would not look suspicious. Elena was really happy that everything happened this way, and that he didn't suspect anything, so she was already looking forward to meeting him next week, which was supposed to happen. However, when she was heading to the castle, she suddenly saw a rather handsome young man in uniform who was walking straight towards her. Seeing him, Elena was even a little confused. She didn't understand what the head butler of the main estate was doing in her annex, so she immediately became wary. But the man, when he came closer to her, immediately bowed and told the lady that he really hoped that everything was fine with her. The girl also greeted him, saying that she was doing well, and also asked what brought him here on this wonderful day. The butler, without raising his head, replied that he had come on behalf of Madame, with a message specifically for her. Elena was a little surprised and said that Helena must have been very busy all these days, since she hadn't given her any instructions. Then the butler finally looked at the lady and said that this was indeed so, and asked for forgiveness on her behalf, saying that she had indeed had a lot of different worries lately. At that moment, Elena thought that it was for this very reason that she did not even want to meet with her personally on small issues. It was easier for the girl to send a servant here so that he would convey all the messages that were needed. Helen did observe formalities as a daughter-in-law. However, she had no intention of getting closer to her, but nevertheless, Elena believed that such efforts were better than nothing, so she did not object. Then the butler finally got down to business and said that a small banquet was planned for a week later, and it was a celebration in honor of the Duke's achievements. Madame would not be able to attend due to the summons of the imperial court, so she would like Elena to attend this event instead. The girl herself finished the sentence, and the butler, hearing this, immediately nodded his head in agreement. The man also said that Madame approved of this, in the hope that Elena would be able to get acquainted with the Western social scene. As soon as the girl heard this, she immediately thought that at least they presented it as an opportunity. They were simply replacing the duty that she had to perform. This made the girls feel a little better, but the butler also said that it would be a small gathering, with only members of the ducal house, the Duke himself, and a few close acquaintances present at the event. He explained that this could help the girl get used to high society and perhaps begin to feel more confident for future events. Elena, without thinking twice, immediately bowed and said that she agreed and would go to this event. When the conversation was over, the girl went further into her room and understood that in reality she didn't really have a choice. They called it recommendations, but a refusal would of course have had its own rather serious consequences. So Elena simply didn't have a chance. But at least the girl knew that it would just be a replacement role, and being just a spectator at that event was quite enough for her. Before leaving, the butler also thanked her and said that he was going to arrange for a seamstress and an experienced noblewoman to help her prepare. As soon as Elena heard about the experienced noblewoman, she immediately asked what it meant, because it made her wary. But the butler explained that since this would be her first time in high Western society, she would need information about how the area differed from where she came from. Elena, hearing this, immediately understood that he was essentially saying that she did not seem noble enough and that she needed etiquette lessons in order to get to this event. Well, actually, the girl didn't object, because she didn't know anything about high society, and so she understood that these lessons certainly wouldn't hurt her, so she said that in that case they could drop in on her after dinner. But the man, hearing about such a precise time, immediately asked if he could find out the reason. Elena answered that it was all obvious, because in the morning she was still too sleepy and did not want to do any important things. In fact, she was already very tired from studying early in the morning. It was like going back to Korea for her, so since she had a choice, she was going to take advantage of it. The man was, of course, surprised for a while when he heard her answer. However, he soon bowed again and said that he would convey everything to the lady. And so, when one day had passed since that moment, after lunch, the girl was already ready to meet her new teacher. Elena was standing outside when a carriage pulled up, and a rather elderly woman emerged from the open doors. Despite her age, she looked quite graceful and impressive. Maids lined up around her to greet the lady. At that moment, Elena carefully examined this woman. It was Baroness Ronald, and the girl even began to worry a little. This lady was the most famous governess who had taught countless noble ladies in the West, and it was she who came to teach Elena. This was the beginning of the girl's first official opportunity as the mistress of the house she had to do. Everything is correct. Viscountess Ronald was the author of the permanent bestseller of The Capital of Modern Etiquette for Women. This girl was known indeed throughout the kingdom. After her husband died, and instead of inheriting the family title, she decided to become a passion for simply being an etiquette instructor and taught countless young girls in order to make their society better. The lessons with Elena were supposed to last for 3 days, and this schedule would certainly not be easy for her, since she had heard about the severity of this woman. Immediately after the first lesson began, the Baroness asked Elena to repeat the same actions several times to make it work. She did it perfectly. The girl straightened her back and told Elena to imagine how her ribcage moved away from her navel. She had to keep it perfectly straight all the time. After this, the woman lifted her chin up and said that she should have kept it straight as well, so that no extra folds would be visible. Then the Baroness moved on to her breasts and shoulders. She said that they should always be straightened, and the head should not follow the gaze. It had to keep the chin constantly in the same position. Then, after the lesson on proper walking and posture, there was a lesson on how to eat properly. They went into the dining room. There were several dishes in front of the girl, and the Viscountess gave her various instructions. The woman said that she had to put her left hand on the edge of the soup bowl and scoop with the spoon from the right, but she couldn't make any noise because that would be very ignorant. Vikanesa also said that when the soup level stopped too low, she could lift the plate slightly in order to finish the rest. Then they moved on to the main course, and the girl said that she had to cut the food into small pieces in order to eat as neatly as possible. Then came the drinks, when I said that if a toast was about to begin, she had to raise her glass to the eye level of the guest of honor and pronounce it, and if anything, wait until the person finished speaking and drink. This day was very difficult for Elena because it almost never ended. She worked very long and hard with the woman because it was really important. When the girl returned to her room after the first lesson, she simply fell onto the bed because she was incredibly exhausted. She didn't think that becoming a duchess could be so difficult. She expected this, of course. However, it still turned out to be so exhausting that it seemed to her that she could even die from this fatigue. However, she was pleased that after some time of their lessons, there was no longer such harsh criticism towards the girl. She was making some progress in her work. Elena also believed that in the next lesson, she had to show herself from the ideal side so that there would not be a single remark in her direction. And indeed, when the next day came after lunch, there was a lesson. They were sitting at a small table, and on it were 2 cups of tea. The Viscountess said that the great Madame should have behaved with the greatest composure. She should not have worried about small mistakes. This was wonderful behavior. Elena immediately thanked the lady for this help, and when some time had passed, their lessons had already come to an end, and the girl had indeed achieved quite great success in her business. Bowing, the Viscountess said that there were some areas that certainly needed improvement. However, since the great Madame did not need to dance, the celebratory banquet should go just fine with her knowledge. Elena heard. This was really glad. It meant that she didn't have a partner to accompany her there, and this was really great for her because she didn't want her to have to worry about this anymore. All that was left for the girl was to simply congratulate the guests and then spend some time at the table, and she believed that somehow she would definitely be able to cope with this without disgracing herself. At that moment, the Viscountess suddenly coughed and told the girl that the correct attitude of Madame towards the young lady who had just made her debut was also of no small importance. However, as soon as Elena saw her cough, she immediately became worried because it seemed rather unhealthy to her. And besides, the woman turned very pale. Madame tried to continue telling her something. However, due to her coughing, it was quite difficult to make out any words. So Elena came closer to her. She looked very worried and said that if this was a lesson that she needed to teach with words, then she thought it would be better for them to sit down so as not to strain themselves unnecessarily. The woman, hearing this, immediately looked at her in surprise. However, she really wasn't feeling her best, so she nodded her head and agreed to take a break. Elena helped her to the sofa and told her to sit down and really rest a little, since this was also quite important. Then the girl stepped aside and began to take out something from a small box. This thing was wrapped in cloth, so that it would not be immediately visible what it was. Elena, meanwhile, moved her farther towards the Viscountess, and as soon as the woman saw this, she was immediately very surprised and asked what it was all about. Elena then began to unfold the cloth and said that it was a hot stone, and if it was too hot for her to hold, she could hold it with the woman's handkerchief. She really thought that was what she needed. The Viscountess was genuinely surprised. She looked at the girl with a look of incomprehension and asked, why did she even decide to do this? Elena then put this stone in her hands and said that her hands were very cold, so she thought it would be better to warm them. What she actually thought about was that even during the lesson, Viscountessa had taken off her gloves several times in order to lose her hands to warm them up, so she really thought it was suspicious. Elena noticed this very well, because she knew that this was a characteristic of people who always had cold hands. The woman could have simply taken off her gloves completely. However, no matter how strict she was in her behavior, she was also strict in regards to etiquette, even when it concerned herself, so the woman simply could not do this for the sake of her own comfort. Yes, even. As soon as the Viscountess began to hold this stone in her hands, she immediately felt a pleasant warmth that spread through her palms. They finally began to warm up, and she really liked it. The woman was immediately very pleased by this, and she thanked her student for such wonderful attention. She passed the stone from hand to hand and said that it was indeed a rather unique hand, warmer that she had never seen before. However, she liked it and would like to have one for herself as well. Elena, smiling happily, said that the stone was brought to her by a servant. She only wrapped it in cloth, that's all, so that it would be a little more comfortable to hold. The woman immediately looked at her and asked if she had really bought this fabric herself. However, the girl replied that this was not so. She simply did it because she thought it was more rational. The Viscountess immediately asked in surprise if she had done this for the servants too, and Elena, smiling happily, said that it really was not a very difficult task, so she was able to cope with it quite quickly, and everyone was happy. In fact, at the junior academy, she had to do quite a variety of tasks, because the children were always very active, and she had to mend their clothes quite often. Sewing was just one of these things. She darned torn clothes and embroidered names on shoe bags so that no one would lose theirs. Smiling happily, the girl said that in the fall, the servant who washed the clothes was told that their hands were very sore from the cold, so she made one such stone for each of them, and there were 20 in total. The Viscountess was genuinely surprised. She couldn't believe that the girl could actually make it with her own hands, and said that she was quite skilled in handling things. But Elena, smiling, asked if not everyone did it. At least she thought that everyone knew how to do such things, and the woman was glad that, smiling, she said that of course this embroidery was part of the sophistication. However, not everyone used this elegance for their servants, and that's why she was a little surprised when she heard it soon after, that the Vicomte took off her gloves and began to warm up with her bare hands on the stone, because it really was a wonderful feeling. Elena watched all this with a smile on her face. Soon after they were brought tea, and the woman said that it contained ginger and dried fruits. She was worried. She asked, did the girl really choose it herself? And Elena said that it was exactly like that, and she offered the Viscountess to drink it before it completely cooled down.